Hello, everybody, and welcome to another week of education, learning. I hope you all are having a blessed week, a great week, and I hope that you enjoyed last week's content and that you are now familiarizing yourself with the way in which this course will go. So last week we talked about the colonial era, and we talked briefly about the settlement of the American colonies. We talked about some key events that occurred within the colonies, things like the First Great Awakening, things like the Enlightenment. We talked briefly about some of the taxes, French and Indian War, those particular things. All of that culminates together to bring about what we now refer to as the American Revolution. And that's where we're going to be starting off this week. We're going to be covering a large amount of content this week, going from the American Revolution all the way up through, in fact, what is sometimes referred to as the Second American Revolution, more properly known as the War of 1812. But if you think back to the causes for the American Revolution, right, one of the things we have to bear in mind is that when the colonials eventually decided to rebel against England, they didn't do that because they were being taxed. It wasn't the taxes themselves that were the problem. In fact, if you remember back, things like the Molasses Act or the Sugar Act, those didn't really impact too many people. Now, there were some taxes that had an impact on a large swath of folks, like the Stamp Act. But the main concern that the colonials had was that they weren't properly being represented within the political system. Now, think back to John Locke and the ideas of the Enlightenment. And as more and more colonials begin to think about their relationship that they have with their government based upon Lockean ideas of self-government, and the government is there to protect the liberties of the people. In that particular context, in addition to the First Great Awakening, all of a sudden the colonials are going to revolt. And the American Revolution actually begins before the Declaration of Independence is issued. The American Revolution begins in 1775 with the shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord. The Second Continental Congress is in session when that shot heard around the world happens. We don't know who fired the first shot, but nonetheless it was shot, and the American Revolution will be on. By 1776, it's very unclear to many what the purpose of the fighting is for, right? Is this for independence, or is it for reconciliation with Great Britain? Now, of course, at the beginning of 1775, you've got a lot of folks who haven't made their decision what way they would like to go. But a very important pamphlet is published in 1775 called Common Sense. It's written by a man named Thomas Paine. And to make a very long story short, basically Thomas Paine argues that it is only common sense for the English colonials, what he now refers to as the Americans, to rid themselves of monarchy and Great Britain and to establish for themselves their own country. And so by July 4th, 1776, we will declare our independence. Now, there are a number of very key battles that occurred during the American Revolution. We can think of things like the Battle of Boston. We can think of the Battle of Saratoga, or battles of Saratoga in 1777. Those particular victories for the United States, or for the Americans, will be incredibly important because following the victories at the Battle of Saratoga, the French decide to ally themselves with the Americans, which is good because they have a navy and the United States didn't. There's obviously the most famous Battle of Yorktown. But I don't want to spend too much time bogged down in details about war strategy and General Washington, who I wore my special shirt here today, Brexit 1776, Mr. Washington. For those of you who know what Brexit is, hopefully that's funny. But nonetheless, by 1783, the United States will vanquish the British following the Battle of Yorktown. That happens actually in 1781. The Treaty of Paris, which ends the American Revolution, happens in 1783. And for better or for worse, the United States is developed. It's created. And really what the Treaty of Paris does is the British recognized the United States as a country. There's a lot of other details within there that we can talk about a little bit later in a meeting if you'd like, face to face. But for better or for worse, we win the war. Now, I'll say that we didn't necessarily win the war because we were the best fighting force on the planet. In fact, Washington, throughout the American Revolution, recognized that if he was going to defeat the British, the strategy he was going to have to take was to simply outlast them, right? Early losses to the British demonstrated that to him. But one of the things that's interesting about the American Revolution is, and one could also ask this about the Constitution, which will be formed not long after, is, was the American Revolution really revolutionary? And on one hand, I think we could argue that yes, it was revolutionary. It was definitely a revolution in political ideology. For the first time, really, what you had was a group of folks who took power into their own hands to create ultimately a republic, and that's important. They will eventually create a republic. And so, in many ways, they were radical thinkers, right, about the way in which government should respond to its citizenry. But on another hand, the American Revolution isn't very revolutionary at all, at least not in the immediate aftermath. In fact, we might think of it being a revolutionary process more than it was a revolutionary event, because what you went, at least from a social point of view, was from a bunch of white men running the show to a bunch of white men running the show. Once the Constitution is finally created, and the Constitution is created in 1787, it eventually gets ratified in 1789, there is a government that's known as the Articles of Confederation that comes into existence before the Constitution, but it is very short-lived. But the reality is that for the most part, the position of most people who weren't white land-owning men, it didn't change much. Slaves were still slaves, although that's not necessarily true. In the northern portion of the United States, many of the northern states will free their slaves, but don't assume that in abolishing slavery in the North, African Americans were somehow treated like white people. They were not. They were still regarded as second-class citizens. Native Americans still did not occupy much of a better social position. Women, for the most part, their social position didn't change, although the idea or concept of Republican motherhood comes into play a bit more forcefully following the American Revolution. And the concept of the Republican motherhood is the idea that women should have a more robust education so that they can then help in the education of their sons. And so in one way, the American Revolution does bring about some changes for women. Yes, let's educate them more, but for what end? The end of their education is not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of their male children. And so really, when we think about the American Revolution, we have to pose that question. Is it revolutionary? And if so, in what ways? And if not, in what ways? Right now, obviously, today, the position of African Americans and women is vastly different than it was immediately following the American Revolution. And so the idea is that all men are created equal, right? Although it may not have been a historical moment where the revolution was revolutionary, we could think of it as being a revolutionary process. But nonetheless, the war comes to an end, and what will occur in 1781 is the Articles of Confederation will be adopted by the Continental Congress, and the Articles of Confederation were really the very first constitution for the United States. And one of the things you'll note is that the Articles of Confederation were incredibly weak. It established a very decentralized government. And the reason for that is that the men who had just fought the American Revolution just fought a war against a very strong federal government. And so when they initially created this government, which was actually first created in 1776, they didn't want to put a bunch of power in the hands of the federal government. The problem with this, however, is that the federal government, after the American Revolution, it effectively had very little teeth. It couldn't really do much of anything, right? It had no judiciary branch. It had no executive branch. It had no ability to tax anybody, right? Rather than finding the power in the hands of the people, right, which is why the Constitution starts with "we the people," Instead, the Articles of Confederation found the power in the states themselves. In fact, if you take a look at I think it's Article 1, maybe Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation, you'll see that one of the very first things they say is that the states retain their sovereignty. They retain their independence, right? Unlike today, where we think about the United States as being one country comprised of 50 states, the reality is that immediately following the American Revolution, it's really a lot better to think of the United States as 13 separate states who have a couple of things that they share interests in. Now, one of the problems that the country is going to face immediately following the war is a lot of debt. And we're going to talk about more of this through your reading, through your videos. But the amount of debt that the country had was staggering. And because the government could not tax the people directly, they had to go to the states and ask them, can we borrow money? And most often the states would say no. There was no way to pay off this debt. And a bunch of farmers, particularly in Massachusetts, were being forced to pay off debts that they had on the local level because the banks were trying to get money to help pay off the federal government, this, that, and the other. In other words, what you're going to get is a bunch of social revolution that's going to happen. Shays' Rebellion is one of the rebellions that historians look to demonstrate the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. But long story short, ultimately, we will call up a convention, a constitutional convention, and the Articles of Confederation will ultimately be tossed out. And what will be created is the system of government that we currently have. The Constitution is the longest living constitution in human history. It's been amended 27 times. The very first 10 amendments to the Constitution came in 1791. We refer to those as the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights have a number of different things in there that protect the people from arbitrary abuses of power by the federal government. Understand what I'm saying here. The Bill of Rights protects the people from arbitrary abuses of power by the federal government. Eventually, that will be expanded to include state governments, but that will only happen with the passing of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. The Constitution is broken up into 7 different articles. The first 3 establish the 3 branches of government, which would be the legislative branch, which is the Congress. And the Congress is what we call a bicameral Congress. That means it has 2 houses. You've probably heard of them before. They would be the Senate and the House of Representatives. You've got the executive branch, which would be wrapped up in the presidency, and then the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. Now, there were a number of compromises that had to be made. Many of the compromises dealt with slavery. Perhaps one of the most horrific things that was ever allowed to be in the Constitution was this compromise called the 3/5 Compromise, which basically stated that when we were calculating how many representatives each state would get in the House of Representatives, instead of counting all of the slaves as persons, instead we would only count 3/5 of the slaves as persons, which again reinforces the idea that African Americans were not wholly people, at least not in the eyes of our founding fathers, and obviously not in the eyes of slaveholders themselves. There was also a fugitive slave law that was put into place in the Constitution. Obviously, that fugitive slave law is null and void following the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. But nonetheless, in 1787, the Founding Fathers finished up their Constitutional Convention, which was held in Philadelphia, and it had to go in for ratification. Now, there was 13 states. According to the Constitution, 9 of the 13 states had to ratify the Constitution in order for the Constitution to become law. That does happen by 1788. However, the 2 most important states, Virginia and New York, had not ratified it within the top 9, but they would be numbers 10 and 11 respectively. And eventually by 1789, the Constitution will be fully ratified. Now, part of the reason why it took so long is because there was debate between a group of people known as the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists over whether or not this Constitution was a good thing. The Anti-Federalists were very fearful of the Constitution because they thought that it provided way too much power to the federal government, and they were very concerned that there wasn't a Bill of Rights. Eventually, they acquiesced and said, if you give us a Bill of Rights later, then we will ratify the Constitution now, and that's exactly what happened. Now, following the ratification of the Constitution, We, of course, are going to elect our first presidents. That would be Washington, and then Adams, and then Thomas Jefferson, and then following that would be James Madison. And just to round it off, just to get in the top 5, you'd have James Monroe. Although this week we're not going to quite get that far. But a lot of unique and different things happened during each of these different presidencies. And I don't have time here to go into the intricate details of each and every one of the key events that took place during these presidencies. For example, you see the formation of political parties during the Washington and Adams administrations. You see the purchase of the Louisiana Territory during Jefferson's administrations. You begin to see the burgeoning development of industry and industrialization during Madison's presidency. And we'll get into all of that through your reading and through other films for this week. But one of the things I want to point out is that the roots of the coming War of 1812 can be found all the way back into the Washington administration. When George Washington is elected to the presidency, and by the way, he received every single vote 2 times. He was unanimously elected. A number of events happened in Europe which are going to ultimately culminate in the War of 1812. And these events would be predominantly issues between France and Great Britain. France and Great Britain go to war with one another. And because the French had helped the United States out in our revolution, they decided that they should get the help from the United States now that they were at war with Great Britain. Well, the problem with this is that many of the members of Washington's cabinet, specifically Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury, they tend to favor different people. Jefferson, who was defined as a Republican, he tended to favor the French, and Alexander Hamilton, who would have been something we would call a Federalist, he favored the British. And there wasn't a clear consensus on who we should support. And ultimately, what Washington decides to do is he says, we're just not going to support anybody. Instead, we will be neutral, but friendly towards all the belligerent powers. In other words, if you two want to go and destroy each other, you go right ahead and kill each other. But we're going to stay out of it. However, we are going to try and continue to trade with both of these nations while they are at war with one another. And what we're going to find is that through the presidencies of Washington and Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and ultimately on the eve of Madison's presidencies, there is continued problems between the United States and France and Britain, predominantly between the United States and Great Britain. One of the key things that the British continue to do is to impress American ships. That is, they're stopping American shipping. They're confiscating sailors. They're taking cargo. They don't want us trading with the French because they're at war with the French, and the French are doing similar things to Great Britain. Doing the same things to us in order to stop Great Britain from getting goods as well. There are also some other issues that the United States has with Great Britain. Predominantly, they have portions of Canada that the United States would like to have access to. Remember that in the early 1800s, our northern border isn't fully set yet. And we also are of the opinion that the British are inciting Native Americans to rebel. And so for these various reasons, the United States by 1812 will declare war against Great Britain. Now, I will tell you this, we come out of the War of 1812 as the victors. In fact, a great intense sense of nationalism really spreads into the United States, and it ushers in a period of history, which we'll look at later, known as the Era of Good Feelings. But the truth of the matter is that the United States got its butt whooped so much during the War of 1812. Perhaps the most climactic moment of defeat came in 1814 when the British marched into Washington, D.C. and torched it. It was only thanks to a storm that ultimately that fire was put out. But what the War of 1812 does, more than anything else, is it provides a sense of identity to the United States. Where the American Revolution created a country, which is where we started this week, the War of 1812 is going to provide for the United States its spirit, its soul, its sense of itself. And that is largely reflected through the song that we now refer to as the Star-Spangled Banner. That poem was written by a Francis Scott Key, no relation, and it is speaking about a battle known as the Battle of Baltimore, which happened in 1814. But the War of 1812 really contributes to the United States really getting a sense of who it is and its own identity. The biggest losers of the War of 1812 are by far the Native Americans. Prior to the war, Native American tribes had attempted to confederate with one another. That is, they tried to create a league of friendship to try to stave off and fight off white settlement, American settlement into the West. Ultimately, that ability is broken apart after the War of 1812, and they are the biggest losers. I've already gone over my 20 minutes here. That's a lot of content, and I only scratched even just the most top of the surface of all of this. I'd love to talk with you guys more, particularly about the Constitution and about your rights. And so if you want to know more about what your rights are, can a police officer, for example, search and seize your phone without a warrant? Can they search and seize your car without a warrant? Things like that. Let me know. I'm happy to join a Zoom meeting and we can talk. So that's what we got this week, guys and gals, and everybody in between. That's what we got. So let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, as always, go in peace. Be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor.